She made 10,000 Canadians learn to chant in Tagalog, and then the match nobody expected happened. A 21-year-old ranked outside the world's top 20 just sold out a stadium in under 30 minutes. Not a concert, not a boxing match, a second-round tennis match on a Wednesday night in a country that isn't even hers. By the time she walked off that court, a tournament director with 20 years on the job was struggling to find the words. A food vendor had quietly rewritten its own menu, and a 7-time Grand Slam champion looked her in the eye and called her something tennis almost never hands out this early: a world star. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. There's a title, there's a movement, there's a legend passing a torch on live television. And then there's a gut punch of a scoreline that landed just hours before this video went up. If you want the whole arc, the rise and the reality check, keep watching, because the last 2 minutes change how you'll read everything that came before them. The setup nobody saw coming. Here's the thing about tennis. It's a sport that rewards patience and punishes hype. Rankings move slowly. Fame moves slower. And for years, one story kept getting buried under bigger names. A teenager from Manila who kept showing up in the draws of the biggest tournaments in the world, quietly climbing, quietly building something that the sports scheduling gurus hadn't quite figured out how to measure yet. Her name is Alexandra Eala. Filipino fans just call her Alex. And if you've been paying attention since her breakout run to the semifinals of the Miami Open back in 2025, you already know she wasn't a surprise. You knew this was coming. Everyone else is just catching up now. But even the people who believed in her couldn't have scripted the 7 days she just had. It starts, like most great sports stories do, with doubt. Even as Eala's ranking climbed into the world's top 20 this year, there was real backlash online. Critics calling her overhyped, questioning whether the crowds and the headlines were outpacing the results. That's not a small detail. That's the tension every underdog story needs. Because on August 3rd, in Washington, D.C., Alexandra Eala answered every single one of those critics in the only language that matters in professional sport: a trophy. The title that started everything. The Mubadala City DC Open was already shaping up to be Eala's tournament. She'd opened by beating Olympic gold medalist Qin Wenjung. Then she took down the defending champion, Leylah Fernandez. By the final, she'd fought through the top 3 seeds in the draw, and standing across the net from her was American star Jessica Pegula. The final didn't go smoothly. Eala dropped the opening set, and then the skies opened. A rain delay halted play entirely, forcing the match to be suspended and finished the next day, on Monday. Imagine that, you're one set away from the biggest win of your career, and now you have to sleep on it, wake up, and finish the job with an entire night to think about what's at stake. She finished the job. Alexandra Eala beat Jessica Pegula and became the first tennis player from the Philippines in history to win a WTA singles title. Let that sink in for a second. Not the first in years, the first ever. A country of over 110 million people, mad about basketball and boxing for generations, just got its first WTA champion, and she's 21 years old. She barely had time to celebrate. Less than 24 hours after lifting that trophy, Eala was on a flight to Toronto for the National Bank Open, a WTA 1000 event, one rung below a Grand Slam, and one of the most physically brutal weeks on the entire tour. She landed exhausted, emotionally spent, still processing what had just happened to her career. And she landed directly into the eye of a storm nobody in Toronto tennis history had ever seen. Why Toronto was always going to be different. Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. According to Canada's 2021 census, there are 957,355 people of Filipino origin living in Canada. And of that number, roughly 272,470, close to 29%, nearly 1 in 3 live in the Greater Toronto Area alone. It's the single largest concentration of Filipino Canadians anywhere in the country. So when the WTA scheduled Alexandra Eala's second-round match for a night session on center court, they weren't just booking a tennis match. Whether they fully realized it or not, they were booking a homecoming for a diaspora hundreds of thousands of people deep, less than a week after their new national hero won her first-ever title. The tickets for that Wednesday night match sold out in under 30 minutes. Think about what that actually means in tennis terms. A Wednesday second-round match is historically one of the least valuable slots on a tournament calendar. No marquee seeding implications yet, no guaranteed star power, nothing but potential. And it moved like a stadium concert. When the doors opened at Sobeys Stadium, the building didn't look like a tennis venue anymore. Philippine flags lined the railings. Fans had made signs, some simply reading Alex, others in Tagalog, declarations of love and support for a player who, a week earlier, most of the tennis world outside Southeast Asia barely knew how to pronounce. Chants of encouragement rolled through the stands between points, sinking with every service toss. And then there was the detail that tells you this wasn't manufactured, wasn't a marketing stunt dreamed up by a tournament committee. A food vendor inside the stadium, without any direction from the tournament or the WTA, quietly swapped one of its regular menu items for a Filipino chicken adobo rice bowl. Nobody told them to do that. They looked at who was walking through the gates and made a decision on their own. That's not a promotional campaign. That's a community claiming a space. Eala walked onto center court that night against American Alicia Parks, and the noise was, by every account from people who were there, unlike anything that stadium had heard. She won it in 3 sets, 6-1, 4-6, 6-2. And when it was over, instead of the usual courtside pleasantries, she turned to the crowd and spoke to them directly, in Tagalog, asking for even more noise, before switching to English to say the words that would end up on highlight reels around the world. There are so many Filipinos in the crowd, so many flags. A legend enters the story. The next night, the story took a turn nobody was expecting, and it involved one of the most famous names in the history of the sport. Eala had a doubles partnership already in motion with Venus Williams, the 7-time Grand Slam singles champion, 4-time Olympic gold medalist, and a name that needs no introduction to anyone who has ever watched tennis. The two had first paired up at the Bad Homburg Open earlier in the year, and Toronto marked their second outing together. They lost. Cato and Samsonova beat them 6-4, 6-3, and Eala and Williams walked off the court in the round of 32 without the win. On paper, that's just a first-round doubles exit. But what happened at the podium afterward is the moment this whole week pivoted from breakout star to something much bigger. Sitting beside Eala at the press conference, Venus Williams didn't offer the polite, generic praise athletes usually hand each other after a loss. She said, plainly, "Alex is a world star. She's just incredible. Besides the fact of her tennis, she's an incredible person, well-spoken, and just an impressive young lady. So I like being around those kinds of things. I think we both lift each other up." Think about the weight behind those words for a second. This is a woman who has genuinely seen everything tennis has to offer. Every kind of hype, every kind of flash-in-the-pan story, every kind of real generational talent. When someone with that resume chooses the words world star for a 21-year-old ranked just outside the top 20, she isn't being polite. She's telling you where the ceiling is, and she's telling you it's much, much higher than the current ranking suggests. Williams even joked about what might come next, telling reporters, "I think Alex has got to put on her list to play with Serena one day. Then she can complete the Williams sisters." Eala, for her part, called playing alongside Venus an amazing highlight of her career, and said sharing the court with her taught her something about mentality, about matching that kind of competitive energy. And Venus wasn't the only star-caliber name to weigh in that week. Coco Gauff, one of the faces of the sport's next generation herself, addressed what was happening around Eala directly in her own press conference. "It's great that one player can bridge the gap between a sport and a nation that hadn't had that representation before. That's two of the most recognizable names in women's tennis, independently in the same tournament, publicly acknowledging that something bigger than a hot streak was happening in Toronto. The match that nearly broke her. If Wednesday was the coronation and Thursday was the torch passing, Saturday was the war." Eala's next singles opponent was American Katie McNally, and McNally was not some easy draw. Ranked well outside the top 50, McNally had spent that same week playing the tournament of her life, upsetting Wimbledon champion Linda Noskova in a stunning comeback from a set and a breakdown, and then beating Tatiana Maria for good measure. She arrived at her match with Eala riding her own wave of momentum, in front of a crowd that, for the first time all week, wasn't entirely on her side. It showed. The match went the full distance. 6-3, 5-7, 6-4. A genuine three-set battle that stretched late into the night. McNally took the second set and, for a stretch, looked like she might be the one to end the run before it truly began. Eala had to dig, and dig hard, to close it out in the decider. "I'm okay. I think I survived that one," Eala admitted afterward. "It was so tough. I want to thank Katie for a great match and for being a great sport." And then, almost as an aside, she shared a moment that says more about what this week meant to her than any statistic could. "Someone in the crowd said they wanted to be Filipino for tonight," she said. "That stuck with me." Read that quote again. A stranger in a foreign stadium, in a country that isn't hers, decided for one night that they wanted to belong to her culture, just to be part of what she was building. That's not fandom in the ordinary sense. That's identity, borrowed and shared for one electric evening. With the win, Eala moved into the round of 16, a 7-match winning streak now stretching back through the DC Open title and into Toronto. Waiting for her there was a genuine veteran, Belinda Bencic, the number 12 seed and the 2015 champion of this very tournament. A former top 10 player who had just survived a 3-hour, 3-set war of her own to reach the same stage. The reality check. Here's where this story stops being a highlight reel and becomes something more honest. Because tennis, unlike the fairy tale version of this week that the flags and the chants and the sold-out stadium might suggest, does not care about momentum or crowds, or how a nation feels watching from thousands of miles away. Cares about what happens on the court point by point. Alexandra Eala lost to Belinda Bencic in the round of 16. The scoreline was lopsided 6-4, 6-0. A result that ended her Toronto run far more abruptly than the week that preceded it would have suggested. After the emotional peaks of the Parks match, the Venus Williams press conference, and the marathon win over McNally, her body and her draw finally caught up with her against a battle-tested former champion who simply had more left in the tank on the day. That's the part of this story a lot of the breathless recaps are leaving out. This wasn't an unbroken fairy tale. It was a real athlete, coming off a title win just days earlier, playing through fatigue, emotion, and the weight of an entire nation's expectations in the stands, and eventually that weight showed up on the scoreboard. But here's why that loss doesn't undo everything that came before it. In the space of 1 week, Alexandra Eala won her first career WTA title, became the first Filipina in history to do so, cracked the world's top 20, sold out a WTA 1,000-night session in half an hour, earned public praise from two of the biggest names in the sport, and pushed her winning streak to 7 matches before it finally ended against a former champion. Momentum isn't measured only by the final result of a single match. It's measured by whether the story keeps growing after the loss, and this one absolutely does. What comes next? Because Toronto was never going to be the ceiling. It was a preview. Eala now turns her attention to the rest of the North American hardcourt swing, with the Cincinnati Open on the horizon. And then, in roughly 2 weeks, the US Open begins at Flushing Meadows, a venue sitting inside Queens, New York, a borough home to one of the largest and most tightly knit Filipino communities anywhere in the United States. If a Wednesday night second-round match in Toronto could sell out in 30 minutes and turn a Canadian stadium into a sea of Philippine flags, ask yourself what happens when the biggest tennis stage in the world sits inside a neighborhood that has been waiting generations for a player exactly like this one. The tournament directors are only just beginning to understand what they're dealing with. The fan base isn't a curiosity anymore. It's a phenomenon that keeps showing up, keeps selling tickets, keeps rewriting menus and turning press conferences into moments that outlast the scorelines that produced them. So here's the real question, and I want you to actually sit with it before you scroll away. Does a round of 16 loss like the one against Bencic mark the moment the pressure finally caught up with a 21-year-old who had barely slept since winning her first title? Or does it become the exact kind of gut punch that a genuine champion needs, right before the biggest stage in the sport? We're about to find out. The US Open is coming. The diaspora that turned Toronto into Manila North is about to show up in Queens in even greater numbers. And Alexandra Eala has 2 weeks to turn a hard loss into fuel. If you were watching this story before the World Star quote, before the sold-out stadium, before any of this made headlines outside tennis circles, you already know how rare a moment like this is. Subscribe, because whatever happens at Flushing Meadows, you're going to want to see it as it unfolds, not read about it after the fact. Drop your prediction below. Does she go deeper at the US Open than she did here in Toronto? Or does the moment need a little more time to build? Let's find out together.